There are several major arguments for school choice and accountability. One is that some parents, some families have more choices available by virtue of the fact that they have just more financial resources. They can move to another community. For example, they can send their kids to private school. Other families don't have those types of resources. So there's that fairness or equity issue as one. A second argument is that to the degree to which public schools may be a monopolist, or alternatively may have less of an incentive to be responsive to their to students and families. If families have more choices, this may induce them to want to work harder to do the things that society wants them to do. A third argument for school accountability in particular is that it's sometimes difficult for us to be able to observe, lift the lid, so to speak, on what's actually going on in the school. So by coming up with some measures of what's going on in the school, this could help us to ensure that educators are doing the things that members of society want them to do. So those are a few examples of reasons why people might choose to want school choice or accountability. What's the Florida Corporate Tax Credit Scholarship Program? It's now called the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program. It provides scholarships to people who are low income. You have to be eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So that is families are within 185% of the poverty line. It's around $40,000 for a family of four, to give people a sense. These families can then use these scholarships for partial payment of tuition at participating private schools. They can be religious schools or non-religious schools. The reason for the funny name, corporate tax credit, or now tax credit scholarship, has to do with the financing mechanism. So the way in which it's actually financed through the state is that corporations provide fully tax creditable contributions to scholarship funding organizations. So that is, private organizations actually administer the scholarship program. It's not directly administered through the state, but it acts as if it were paid for by the state. And what impact has the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program had on public schools? My findings suggest that it has had a small but detectable positive effect on public schools. And the positive effect has come through two different ways. One is through composition. And by composition, I mean that the biggest users of this program have been kids who were performing very poorly in the public schools. Now some of them are going to private schools, and it appears that that's making the public schools either more productive or looking better. The second involves competition. So private schools now are competing for some of these students that maybe perhaps sometimes educators weren't paying as much attention to before. And that appears to be leading the public schools to, in a small way, but again, a positive and detectable way, step up their game, I guess, would be one way of thinking about it. Other than having higher enrollments, how does the program benefit private schools? So I think that's an open question. Some private schools might not have been able to be at scale without having this program. So the overwhelming majority of students who are participating in this program are going to established private schools, generally religious private schools, that were arguably at scale before. But some students who are going to this program are going to private schools that were very small. If this program may make these private schools larger, perhaps they can take advantage of, say, having more teachers, for example, spreading out administrative burdens over more people, for example, and that could make them more likely to be financially solvent. It could have a negative effect on these private schools as well. So think about who are the participants in this program. By definition, every participant in this program has to be relatively low income. And and we have found out through research that the people who are tending to go are not the typical low-income student, but the low-income student who was especially struggling in the public school. So now if you're taking low-income students from the public schools, poorly performing low-income students from the public school, moving them into a private school, well, it's providing those private schools with more enrollment and more revenues, but may actually be helping, in some cases, making it harder for these private schools to do their jobs as well. So I think it's a mixed bag as to whether this is helping or not helping private schools. What evidence is there that school accountability and voucher programs are changing policies and practices within the school? So there's strong evidence of a few different things. One thing we know, I think for sure, is that public schools now in its era of accountability have been somewhat narrowing their curricula. So it's almost a truism that what gets measured gets done. And both opponents and advocates of school accountability will point to that same basic truism, which means it must be true, right? Opponents argue, oh, well, what about all the things that public schools used to be doing that they're maybe not doing as much because they're not getting credit for it? And there seems to be some evidence that is going on. Advocates of school accountability say, well, maybe schools weren't doing these things that we cared about as much as they should have been. And so if we get the measurement down right, those schools are doing more of that. There's certainly evidence that public schools are improving along the dimensions that are directly measured by accountability systems. So that's one thing. Another thing that appears to be happening is that we can trace out at least the fact that public schools are trying different things. So my research has suggested that public schools have become more entrepreneurial in terms of trying different types of things, maybe experimenting with block scheduling, for example, or looping, the process of having individual kids with the same teacher for multiple years, or trying new things such as floating grouping, and by that I mean informally identifying 3 or 4 struggling kids from one class, pulling them together with 3 or 4 struggling kids from another class. So there is evidence in Florida, which is where I conducted that research, to suggest that public schools are becoming more entrepreneurial as a consequence of this program. I view that as a positive thing. So what we see is a mixed bag. Now, I will tell you one thing that used to happen in Florida and is happening around the country that's not happening as much anymore by virtue of the change that happened in Florida's laws in 2002. So if you look in the first couple of years of school accountability in Florida, there was a lot of evidence to suggest that schools were really engaging in certain types of what I would call gaming behavior. So we saw some evidence, for example, that kids who were struggling students were excluded from the testing pool. So maybe they were reclassified as learning disabled and didn't have to take the FCAT, or that they were disciplined extra hard so that they weren't actually taking the test. What Florida did in 2002 is make it a lot harder for those things to happen. And the main reason they did that was by changing the way in which schools were graded, from just saying, okay, fraction of kids who pass a test, to a combination of did you pass the test as well as are kids making gains. That's much harder. I bring this up because most states are like Florida Accountability version 1.0. And that means that we're seeing those same types of things happening in a number of different states. That was a long answer. But if I were Commissioner of Education, I would be in favor of several different things. The first is I would be in favor of providing relatively uniform types of accountability for all schools that are receiving public funding, be they a be they a traditional public school, a magnet school, an alternative public school, a charter public school, or a private school if the private school is receiving public funding. For example, here under the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program or the McKay Scholarship Program. So that's one thing I think is very important. There is very little credible argument in my mind for differentiating public schools versus private schools just because they're public or private. So if I could enact one thing tomorrow, it would be to push very strongly for that. How about that?